Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing Crash. This film came out in 1996. It was directed by David Cronenberg. I saw Cronenberg's most recent film, Crimes of the Future, recently, and I reviewed it. And naturally I had planned on revisiting this one and reviewing it just because it felt very fitting, very topical. I did enjoy Crimes of the Future quite a bit, even though it felt a little bit thin in some places and it left a little bit to be desired for me compared to some of his other films that are quite famous, such as, of course, The Fly and Videodrome, and of course Crash being a huge one. Crash is very Cronenberg, and yet it's also very different for him. It feels more abstract, more esoteric in nature compared to some of the other films that dealt with similar subjects. And, you know, typically I think of him as very heady and very cerebral and more expository and dialogue driven. And compared to certain films, there isn't much clarity here. It's a very tricky, very slippery feeling watching this film. And I do think for myself, it's maybe more evolved for him. And not everybody sees it that way, trust me. I would say it's certainly not a film that is easy to digest for a lot of people. When it premiered initially at the Cannes Film Festival, that was an infamous screening where people were booing and there were walkouts and such, and I believe it was Francis Ford Coppola who infamously hated the film, you know, to a major degree. I just think it's very interesting just to see what kinds of movies trigger certain people, and I think it says a lot about certain people, subconsciously or otherwise. And typically, it's the more taboo subjects like sex and violence, movies that deal with those kinds of subjects. Personally, when I watch this film, I don't really understand at all why someone would be offended by it. I guess I just don't think that way, but I can absolutely understand why people wouldn't like it. Because, as I said, it is just a really, really tough film to get into, and yeah, some really detest it and others are really intrigued by it. I have to admit, the first time I saw the film, I was almost indifferent to it. It was a very, very strange reaction I had. I just felt so unsure about my opinion, and there was something about the neutrality of my opinion on it that I felt I have to see it again, and I knew it would go away. I knew instantly I would know, you know, what I felt about it, whether I really like it or whether I don't. And yeah, the second time I saw it, I was right. Within maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes, I knew that this film was very much for me and that I really, really enjoy it. But it has become such an iconic piece of experimental filmmaking, and it is considered to be one of Cronenberg's best films, which is really saying a lot, but it's also considered one of the best films of its type, one of the better films of the 1990s. I think it could be one of those films as well that needs multiple viewings. You may not get anything out of it maybe the first time you see it, maybe the second time you see it, and sometimes it takes a while for you to have maybe a breakthrough where all of those symbols and the interactions and the voyeuristic experience of it all just snaps into place and it really clicks. There is a kind of flowing sort of energy to this film, like a fluid kind of consistency, I think. It's very dreamy, where everything runs together very much kind of like a river, where you're not really sure where one event is ending and where one begins. You're not sure what is literal and what is not literal. And I think overall it just, yeah, it has a very hazy, very soporific feeling where you can kind of just let it take you. And sometimes I don't even think you really need to think during it. Just let it wash over you. I think Cronenberg really likes to probe, particularly here, he likes to probe surfaces and textures. And through that superficiality, that's where maybe you can arrive at something. It's like layer upon layer upon layer of superficiality. And then you kind of sink your teeth into something a little bit different. And I don't know, I think it kind of creates an interesting meditation on human interaction, particularly in modern society, as the key. And what is this movie about? Maybe in a broad sense, that is the age-old question. And I think it's naturally a very complicated answer. It's going to depend on the person. And there are so many ideas going on here, as is very typical with Cronenberg. But I think that one of the great things about him is he is just such a master of taking so many different subversive elements and marrying them together. It's like he can take all these different ideas and somehow it still feels very homogenous. In his best films, to me, he never really feels disorganized. Everything feels very focused and very compact. You can have a movie about so many things that you can have conversations for hours about it, but the actual film itself, the runtime tends to be, you know, very compact, maybe an hour and a half, maybe a little bit longer. It just doesn't feel indulgent to me. And I find that really refreshing. But yeah, I think you could look at this film like you can look at many different films. It's about maybe people's need to feel alive, the search to find the feeling of being alive through all kinds of modern sensibilities, whether it is destruction through voyeurism, destruction through exhibitionism. Artistic expression is a big one for Cronenberg, but most importantly for me, I think it's about what it means to be very primal, to be, you know, a violent, sexual, wild human being in a very sedentary society, in a society where all of our impulses and all of our instincts are repressed by civility. But how does a modern civilization create a different kind of destruction, one that is perhaps a little bit indirect? And it's like, well, there's kind of this claustrophobic need to kind of rip at the facades that we have created around ourselves. There's a need to claw at this disconnect that we have that is supposed to be a means of control to protect ourselves. But there's also a heavy irony when it comes to civility. And I look at the title Crash, and especially just the whole metaphor of dealing with cars, I think is just absolutely brilliant. I drive a lot, so I think about these things all of the time while I'm driving. But obviously driving is a very modern thing. It's something that we're very lucky to have. Technology makes it possible for us to get there so much quicker than we otherwise would. And you just get to sit in one place and you are in control of the wheel. It's a very interesting thing, but I also think it's strange because, we can go so fast down a highway, and the dangers of it we don't really think about. I mean, I suppose we do on maybe a peripheral level, but typically we don't think about it too much until it's too late, until a big car crash happens. And when you are on a freeway, it's like maybe somebody's in your blind spot and you don't see them, and boom, I mean, something horrific can happen. I don't know, I just think it's very interesting that it is such a big part of a lot of different people's lives, and it's naturally a very comfortable aspect of modern society, aspect of living, but it's also so dangerous at the same time. And even though we do it every single day, you can also add the aspect of just the slavery of it all, just the idea of everybody driving in the same direction to a 9-to-5 job every single day. And there is this disconnect. There are all these strangers next to you and are all just going in the same direction. But then there's also the idea of, an actual car crash. You're on the freeway and there's a crash ahead of you somewhere and it causes traffic to stop. And it's like a lot of the time we don't think about, oh, I hope that person's okay. It's more like, oh, it's an inconvenience for me because I'm going to be late for where I need to go. But we all drive very slowly by the crash scene just to see if there's mangled bodies or whatever. And the moment we see what we need to see, we speed up and just keep going and forget about it. And so yes, I really like that this is a big metaphor for the film, because I do think crashes and cars and driving and all of that, it encapsulates a sort of, again, civil, modern sort of risk. And, the disconnect, it absolutely carries a lot of that, existentialism, lack of identity, claustrophobia, and all on a very basic level. I really love the shot, and I think it might be in the second scene where James Spader is having sex with Catherine, I believe, and they're on the balcony of, I guess, their apartment or whatever. And the camera kind of hovers over them, or kind of like over the shoulder, over the hands or whatever. And it kind of has this weird kind of dangling, hanging over the cliff feeling, an edge to it. And then it kind of hovers over, below, and you see all the little cars driving on the freeways. And I think that's a really, really great image. It's very sexy, it's very film noir, but it also has that dangerous and very modern feeling to it, as I said. And this movie is full of shots like that. I swear every single moment is just weaving all of the ideas together perfectly. It's very satisfying. I do really love that Cronenberg has such a coldness to him, which is kind of counterintuitive when you consider a lot of body horror. You normally think, well, that's very rooted in the flesh, it's very emotional. I think, though, for him, this absolutely works for what he is trying to do. I think he should always be removed, and there should be a voyeuristic feeling to this particular type of film, and there should not be easy answers. I suppose in the 1990s, we had a lot of movies that are about that existential crisis, this feeling, this 9-to-5 sort of sedentary living that we find ourselves in just as Americans, and maybe the struggle with maybe your purpose. And I think something like Crash, though, is doing that, but in a way that's much more provocative than what we're used to. Because Cronenberg is interested in the art itself, and he's interested in the subject of art as a destructive device. And that's something that I think a lot of people, especially a lot of creators maybe, are afraid to talk about, because it's a touchy subject for sure, but I personally find it necessary, especially when you think about things like sex and pain and self-expression. They're all kind of intertwined as concepts, but they're all kind of right next door to each other, and they can easily blend in a certain circumstance. And with violence in modern society, it's like, where does that satisfaction come from for us when we don't live a world where it's like a survival of the fittest sort of competition every day? Well, it comes from what? The cinema. It comes from voyeurism. It comes from art, it comes from media, it comes from the ability to project ourselves onto something. And it allows us to have a feeling of something without actually having the literal experience. And there's also this very contradictory idea of how we choose to feel alive, but it's ultimately often through destruction. It's like we feel the most alive when we're chasing death. We feel the most alive when we're having a near-death experience. And, cars and that sudden instant impact sort of feeling, that's a thrill that they're capturing here. There are certain film directors who love taking taboo subjects like this. I think about like Julia Ducournau recently with Titane. She takes a lot of these concepts and brings them together, but it is more of an emotional experience. And I look at somebody, this is, very different, but like Gaspar Noé. I reviewed Vortex recently, but I look at Gaspar Noé as somebody who is, removed from what is cerebral, and he's more fascinated by the emotion of the taboo subjects that we're discussing here. With Cronenberg, and especially with this particular film, I think he is more fascinated by the characters rather than getting emotionally involved with them. He is observant, but he's not judgmental. And I think if we had crossed over into a certain type of emotion with the characters and the interactions, I think it would really limit the concepts overall. The film does have like a very cold, as I said, feeling, but it's also a very gross sort of feeling, a dirty sort of feeling. And I don't know, it's body horror has just this feeling to me where it's like, I don't know, it's like unnerving to me. It's like an insect kind of like boring into my brain. And I don't know, when I think about Cronenberg, and particularly this movie, there's a specific feeling that I latch onto, and it's a feeling of like you go to a 9-to-5 job every single day. You're very used to it. You may not love it, but you don't hate it. But you sit under fluorescent lighting and you sit at a desk all day, and maybe you have an itch on your skin, and it's kind of annoying. And you sit there all day and you're just itching. You forget that you're itching it for so long. And after a while, it's going to get bigger and bigger, and maybe it gets infected. And you just have this weird like addiction. You cannot stop picking at it. And it's like, what is that? What is, it's very unsettling, but what is that? Well, most doctors are going to say, it's a nervous tic, it's anxiety. But I really think it's more building claustrophobia or just like boredom, I suppose. But I think at a certain point that starts to build up within you, and you need kind of a release from that repetitive lifestyle. There is a line in this movie that I think captures that absolutely beautifully, and it's when Spader gets in the first car crash and he wakes up, he's in the hospital. He says something like, after being bombarded endlessly by like road safety propaganda, that it was almost a relief to find himself in an actual accident. And I think if that line resonates with you, if it resonates with you in your life or whatever, I think you might have an in with this film. Really, what is the difference between your civil self and your primal self? It's a very gray area. And again, it's through the surfaces that we're getting to tap into all of this with the film. When you look at all the different characters in this film, they're very lost people, and it's very clear. They're just kind of drifting around. But it is necessary for an anchor, and I do feel that the great anchor here, the thing to kind of rein everything in, is the character of Vaughn, who, I don't know, brings a very stark feeling to the film. It's like a very live wire sort of energy that I can't quite put my finger on. There is a darkness to him, and he has kind of a ruggedness to him, but he really keeps the film moving and really keeps that forward momentum going in a way that I really like. And it's because of his passion, and the people around him see that. It's like they realize he knows what he's doing, and they're very transfixed by it, and they want to help him on that journey. And that's where the whole exhibitionism of art comes into focus through performance art, and of course his thesis on meaning and voyeurism, and what makes a crash cinematic versus what makes it real. But Vaughn is a character that I think really reveals the fetishistic nature of destruction in all kinds of different forms. And even with tattoos, there's an interesting scene where he is getting tattooed that I really love, because that's another thing I find very interesting. The ritual of it, the expression of it is both meaningful, but it requires pain. It's kind of like a branding of sorts to create something that is meaningful to you. Or maybe it's not. Maybe you're getting a tattoo just for the aesthetic of it. It really depends on the person. This is a very seductive nature of different social rituals are looked at in very different ways by different people. And especially like somebody like Vaughn, which I find really interesting. I think one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie is probably the car wash scene. It's a famous sex scene, of course, and I just think it's absolutely masterfully done. Just the water rushing, the sounds of turbulent machinery, and the car windows closing. And I feel like also James Spader, the way he's sitting in the front, he sees everything through that rearview mirror, and there's that voyeuristic angle that is very similar to us as we're watching the movie screen. And I like that the camera is always, I mean, not always, but it'll be inside of the car capturing this intimacy, but then it'll always go outside it at the same time. It's constantly going in and out and in and out. And again, I think that's very important to remember that disconnect from these characters. And because of that, and because of so many of these different things working together, it doesn't feel, you know, sexy and in an indulgent sort of way, or sexy for the sake of being sexy. I think it's some people might find it very erotic, and other people might think it's more grotesque, or you might feel more dirty in it. And I think it's very interesting to hear people's answers to that question. I do find that when I talk to people, it seems that the third act really does lose people a lot, and you know, it's because you've got all these different characters and they're slowly becoming more and more lost. It's not like everything's coming together in a way that you're used to. And so everything is becoming a little bit more inscrutable as it goes. And we become more removed from the characters, or at least I do. For me, I think it really works just because of the experimental nature of the mood of everything. And as the movie goes on, especially like in the last scene, I think it's a very tragic scene and a very tragic image that is, again, very voyeuristic in its tone. But I just love this film. I love just how unabashed it is, and it captures something very raw and rough in a very clinical society, and it merges the two so perfectly. It's always consciously through the lens of a camera. It's neatly packed in this film noir sort of framing device, but of course it does grow very blurry and numbing. And if it does lose you, I honestly think that's almost okay. Like, I almost feel like it's okay to take a nap in this movie. And I have said this before recently, but you know, I talk about a lot of my favorite movies are the ones where you can fall asleep during it and wake up and you're still very much connected to the experience, and it feels like you didn't really miss anything. And this film absolutely has that quality for me. I do think sex and violence, or physical connection in any sort of way, physical energy, is very hard to express in words in a way that really captures it all. So seeing all the different ways people communicate through physicality, I think maybe is more universal. And I do think that about this film. I absolutely do recommend this to certain people. I recommend it if you are a major cinephile, if this kind of thing sounds up your alley, if you're interested in things that are really going to challenge you, then this is going to be perfect for you. And obviously, if you're a Cronenberg fan, of course, I recommend this film. And even if you are some great cinema lover, you might absolutely detest it, and that is completely okay. Like I said, this is a movie where I totally understand if that's your point of view, but personally, it's not for me. I find it to be really refreshing and really interesting, and I think there are just so many different conversations one could have. And that's just something that I love. So yeah, absolutely. This is a great, great film. But that is the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I want to plug my website as usual. It is deepfocuslens.com. I'm an artist and I do commissioned portraits and I sell prints of my work. If that is something that you're interested in, you can always go to the website below. And if you have a question about a commission or a print, you can always email me. My email is in the description box below as well. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons who are wonderful. Thank you guys so much for your support. If you are interested in supporting, the link for that is below, as well as the rest of my social media information. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.